I didn't cry when my granddaughter called me. I didn't gasp. I didn't say, "Oh my God, what happened?" I just looked at the clock on my microwave, 11:47 at night, and I said, "Where are you right now?" She said, "Grandma, I'm at the park, the one near the library." I said, "Don't move." I hung up, put on my coat over my pajamas, picked up my keys, and backed the car out of the garage. The streets of Oakville were empty that Tuesday in November. I drove with the heat on full and both hands on the wheel, and I didn't let myself think about anything except getting to her. I found her on a bench near the fountain. She had her 2 little ones with her, my great-grandchildren, 4 and 6 years old, both of them asleep against her, one on each side. She had a duffel bag at her feet and a garbage bag tied up next to it. That's what she managed to take. A duffel bag and a garbage bag. She looked up when she saw my headlights. The look on her face nearly broke something in me. Not fear, shame. She was ashamed to be sitting there. That's the part I couldn't let go of for weeks afterward. That my granddaughter felt ashamed for surviving. I opened the back door of the car. I put the children in without waking them. My granddaughter sat in the passenger seat and stared straight ahead while I loaded her bags into the trunk. She didn't speak until we were on the QEW, and then all she said was, "She had everything planned, Grandma." I don't think I ever had a chance. I said, "Tell me everything." She did. The whole 40-minute drive home, she talked. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew exactly what her mother-in-law had done, and I understood why she had done it. What I hadn't told my granddaughter yet, what I hadn't told anyone in that family, was that I also knew exactly what I was going to do about it. My granddaughter's name is Petra. She's 31. She has her mother's eyes and her late grandfather's stubbornness, and she has worked since she was 16 years old without anyone handing her anything. She met her husband at university. He was studying business. She was finishing a nursing degree. And they were married 5 years ago in a small ceremony in Niagara-on-the-Lake. His family came from money. Old money. The kind that makes people forget how to be decent. His mother's name is Vivian Ashworth Cole. I will use her name because she used mine. Vivian had never liked Petra. She made that clear from the first Christmas dinner when she spent 20 minutes explaining to Petra how her son had been accepted to a master's program at Queen's before he chose to travel instead, as though Petra needed to understand what she was getting. Petra smiled and passed the rolls and didn't say a word. That's how she was. Gracious. I watched it and I thought, this woman underestimates my granddaughter. Most people do. The trouble started about 18 months ago. Petra's husband, I'll call him my grandson-in-law because that's what he was to me, whatever he became later, had a business with 2 partners. They ran a mid-sized property management company, maybe 40 residential properties across the GTA. Petra had nothing to do with the business. She was working full-time at a hospital in Mississauga, nights and weekends both, raising 2 children, and she had no involvement in the company whatsoever. That's important. Remember that. Vivienne was involved, though. She had lent the company money early on, $200,000, and that loan had given her a sense of ownership that the paperwork did not technically support. She came to meetings she hadn't been invited to. She called my grandson-in-law 3 and 4 times a day. She had opinions about the company's direction, the staffing, the contracts, and somewhere in those 18 months, she decided that Petra was the problem. I don't know if she said it to herself that plainly. Maybe she never did. Maybe she just started making small moves and told herself each one was justified. That's how people like Vivienne operate. They don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as protecting what's theirs. The first thing she did was plant a seed with her son. She told him that Petra seemed distracted, that she'd noticed it over the holidays, that she was worried about him, about their marriage, about whether Petra was really present. My grandson-in-law came home and said this to Petra as though it were a caring observation. Petra told me about it on the phone. I said, "That's not concern, that's a campaign." Petra said, "Grandma, she's his mother." I said, "Yes, she is." The second thing Vivienne did was more deliberate. She told her son that she'd seen a transfer from the business account. a transfer of funds to a personal account she didn't recognize. She showed him a screenshot. She had bank documents, or something that looked very much like bank documents, and she told him the account belonged to Petra. It did not belong to Petra. This I know for a fact because Petra called me sobbing at 9 in the morning on a Thursday and told me everything, and because I spent the next 3 weeks quietly verifying every detail on my own. The account belonged to a numbered company. Petra had never opened a numbered company. Petra didn't even know what a numbered company was in that specific context until this situation forced her to learn. But the screenshot looked real. The documents looked real. And her husband, who loved her and had been slowly surrounded by his mother's version of events for more than a year, looked at those documents and chose to believe his mother. He asked Petra to leave the house. She called him every name I would never say out loud, and some I would. And then she packed what she could fit in 2 bags while the children watched from the hallway, and she left. She didn't call me until hours later. She sat in that park for almost 4 hours before she picked up the phone because she didn't want to be a burden. My granddaughter sat in a park in November for 4 hours because she didn't want to be a burden. When she finished telling me all of it, she said, "I'm sorry, Grandma. I know this is a lot." I pulled into the garage and turned off the engine and sat in the quiet for a moment. I said, "Do you know what I did before I retired, sweetheart?" She said, "You worked in real estate." I said, "I did." What I did not say and what she did not know was the specific shape of what that career looked like. I had been quiet about it for a long time, mostly because I find loud people exhausting and I didn't want to become one. But the short version is this. I started buying properties in the 1980s when the market looked very different than it does now. I bought smart, and I bought often, and I held on when other people sold. By the time I retired 12 years ago, I had a portfolio that my accountant managed and my lawyer handled, and my family mostly didn't ask about because they assumed it was modest. A small nest egg. A few rental properties. Something to leave behind one day. They were not wrong that it would be left behind one day. They were wrong about the size. And among the things I had owned for going on 11 years, were 2 commercial buildings in Mississauga. One of them housed a gym, a dental office, and a tech startup that came and went. The other one housed 3 businesses on the ground floor and, on the second floor, a property management company that had been a tenant of mine since they first signed a 5-year lease, renewed twice, my grandson-in-law's company. The company into which Vivian Ashworth Cole had placed $200,000 in her entire identity. They had never met me. Why would they? I owned the building through a numbered company, the very thing Petra had been accused of knowing about, and my property manager handled all communications. My name appeared nowhere that a tenant would see it. For 11 years, they had sent their rent check to a management office in Burlington and never once asked who signed the lease on the other end. I want to be clear about something. I did not decide that night to use this. I went inside and I made up the beds in the guest room and I put the children under warm blankets and I sat with my granddaughter at the kitchen table with tea until 2 in the morning while she cried and talked and eventually fell asleep in the chair. I covered her with a blanket and I turned off the lights and I went to bed. I lay there for a long time. What I kept coming back to was the look on her face when I found her on that bench. The shame, the idea that she had been so thoroughly convinced of her own guilt that she sat in the cold for 4 hours rather than ask for help. Vivian had done that. Whatever documents she'd forged or manipulated or had someone else manipulate for her, the real damage was that. The shame. That was intentional. That was the point. I called my lawyer in the morning. She has been my lawyer for 22 years, and she does not waste words, which is why I like her. I told her what had happened. I told her what had happened. I told her what I owned and where. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How do you want to handle this?" I said, "Carefully and completely." The first thing we did was nothing, or it looked like nothing. My granddaughter stayed with me, the children went back to school, and we said very little publicly. My grandson-in-law called twice. Petra did not answer. His mother did not call because his mother did not have my number and did not know who Petra's grandmother was. beyond a woman in her 60s who brought squares to Christmas dinner. The second thing we did was begin the process of not renewing the commercial lease. The lease on the property management company's space was due for renewal in 4 months. My lawyer sent the standard notice through the management office. No renewal would be offered at this time, as the owner was considering alternative use for the space. This is legal. This is within every right a landlord has in Ontario. There was nothing aggressive or unusual about it. It was simply a letter. I heard from my grandson-in-law's business lawyer within the week. He wrote to my management office expressing concern, noting that the company had been a tenant in good standing for over a decade, asking whether there was any room for discussion. My lawyer handled the response. Polite, brief. The owner's decision was final. Then I waited. I want to tell you about what Vivienne did during this time, because I only learned about it later from Petra, who heard it from her husband after everything came out. While I was waiting, Vivienne was celebrating. She had won. Her son had sided with her. The daughter-in-law was gone. The grandchildren were, in her view, now accessible to her without Petra as a barrier. She told friends she was devastated but not surprised that the marriage had hit this point. She said Petra had always seemed a little unstable. She used that word, unstable. For a woman who had worked nights in a hospital for 5 years and raised 2 children and never once asked Vivienne for anything. The third thing I did was hire a forensic accountant. I paid for it myself and I told no one. She was recommended by my lawyer and she was very good at her job. It took her 6 weeks to trace the numbered company back to its actual owner. It took another 2 weeks to build the documentation. When she called me to give me the summary, she said, "You're going to want to sit down." I told her I was already sitting. She told me who had opened the numbered company and when and what the account had been used for. It was not Petra. The company had been opened 3 years ago by someone acting as a signing officer for a holding company tied to the Ashworth Cole family. The transfers Vivienne had shown her son as evidence were transfers that had moved money out of the business, not to Petra's account, but to this account, over a period of 14 months. The total was significant, not $200,000. More. What Vivienne had done was use Petra's image to cover her own tracks. The screenshot she'd shown her son was real. The account was real. The transfers were real. She had simply changed one small detail, the name of the account holder, in a document she'd had altered and shown it to her son, who trusted her and destroyed a marriage to keep him from looking in the right direction. My lawyer took everything to a forensic litigation specialist. The specialist confirmed it was actionable. I said, "Then act." I was not present for most of what happened next. That's not how these things work. Lawyers make calls. Documents are filed. Notices are sent. But I'll tell you what I know. On a Wednesday morning in February, my grandson-in-law received a package from a law firm he didn't recognize. Inside was a letter explaining that his company's landlord, the numbered company that owned the building on Huron, Ontario, where his office had been for 11 years, had retained legal counsel regarding certain financial irregularities associated with his business account. The letter referenced documentation that would be shared with his business partners and, pending their response, with the appropriate regulatory bodies. He called his mother. I know this because my granddaughter was told about it later in detail when her husband showed up at my door. He drove here himself. He didn't call first. He knocked on my door on a Saturday afternoon with his coat open and his face pale, and he said, "Is Petra here?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Can I come in?" I said, "That's up to her." He looked at me for a long moment. I've known this young man for 7 years. I've made him Christmas dinner. I've watched him hold his children. He's not a bad person. He's a person who was badly managed by someone who loved him in the wrong way. He said, "Did you know when this started? Did you know what you owned?" I said, "I knew what I owned. I didn't know what she'd done until Petra called me from that park." He put his hand over his eyes. He stood there on my front step in the February cold, and he did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "I have to fix this." I said, "Yes, you do." I let him in. I won't go through the full conversation. That's between the two of them, and I wasn't in the room for most of it. I made coffee and I sat in the kitchen and I could hear my granddaughter's voice, low and steady, and I could hear him. And after a while, there was quiet. And then I heard crying. And then more quiet. What happened afterward took months. Marriages don't unbreak in an afternoon. Trust doesn't come back because someone knocks on a door and says, "I'm sorry." But I'll say this, he did what he said he was going to do. He went to his business partners. He cooperated fully with the process. He told the truth about what he'd been shown and what he believed and how long he believed it. Vivian hired a lawyer. Of course she did. There were weeks of back and forth that I wasn't part of. What I know is that there was a settlement. I won't speak to the specifics because that's not mine to share, and I know that my grandson-in-law repaid his business partners, and I know that Vivian Ashworth Cole no longer speaks to her son. That was her choice. He asked her to admit what she'd done, directly, to Petra. She refused. He stopped taking her calls. I don't know if that will last. I hope it does. But hope is not the same as certainty, and I'm 68 years old, and I've learned not to confuse the two. Petra moved back into the house in March. I helped her move. We carried boxes, and I gave her the bread maker I've had since 1997 because she's always wanted it, and I never use it anymore. We stood in her kitchen, and she made tea, and we sat at her table, not mine, and she looked at me and said, "How did you know what to do?" I said, "I didn't always know. I just didn't panic." She said, "You weren't scared?" I thought about that. I said, "I was scared when I found you on that bench. I was scared when I saw your children asleep with their coats still on. That's the part that scared me." She nodded. I said, "The rest of it was just paperwork." She laughed. That was the first time I'd heard her laugh in months. It sounded like it used to, like something was returning. I drove home that evening and I stopped at the Tim Hortons on Lake Shore and I got a medium coffee and I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before I drove the rest of the way home. Not for any dramatic reason. I was just a little tired and the coffee was hot and I didn't want to rush. If you're reading this or watching this and you're in the middle of something that feels unwinnable, if someone has built a version of events around you that you know isn't true, but you don't know how to prove, I want to say something to you directly. The person who is lying about you is counting on your silence. They are counting on you believing that the documentation, the appearance of legitimacy, the support they have lined up, they're counting on all of that making you feel like you've already lost, like it's already over, like sitting on a park bench in November is the end of the story. It is not the end of the story. Stay calm. Tell someone you trust. Do not disappear quietly because they've made you feel ashamed of something you didn't do. Ask for help. Write everything down. Remember what is actually true. And if you have someone in your corner, even one person who knows something the other side doesn't know, let them help you. That's all I have to say about that. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot since all of this happened. Not in any formal way. Just the way you do when you're older and you've watched enough unfold to start seeing the shape of things. Vivienne didn't wake up one morning and decide to destroy someone. That's not how it works. What she did was make a small choice and then a slightly larger one and then one that couldn't be undone. Each step probably felt justified at the time. That's the part that stays with me. People rarely think of themselves as the villain in the moment. They think they're protecting something. They think they're correcting an imbalance. They tell themselves a story that makes the next move feel reasonable, and then the next one, and eventually they've done something that cannot be walked back. Petra sat on that bench because she had been made to feel guilty for something she hadn't done. That's what Vivienne actually built. Not a legal case, not a financial trap, but a feeling. Shame is a powerful thing. It makes people go quiet when they should speak. It makes them wait when they should act. It makes a 31-year-old woman sit in the November cold for 4 hours rather than call her grandmother. What I keep coming back to is this. Petra didn't survive that situation because of anything dramatic. She survived it because she finally made one phone call. That's all. One call. Everything else followed from that. I think about the young women who might be sitting somewhere right now in a version of what Petra was in. Maybe it's not a mother-in-law. Maybe it's a boss, or a partner, or someone in the family who has quietly built a story around you that isn't true. And maybe you're staying quiet because the evidence against you looks convincing, or because the person doing it is trusted by everyone around you, or because you don't want to be a burden. I understand that. I understand it in a way I wish I didn't. But here's what I know from 68 years of watching how things actually turn out. The people who manipulate their way into power do not hold it. Not because the universe is fair. I'm not going to tell you the universe is fair because it isn't always, but because manipulation requires constant maintenance. You have to keep adjusting the story. You have to keep managing what people see. And eventually, something slips. A document doesn't match. A date is wrong. Someone asks a question the story can't answer. What Vivian didn't account for was that the ground she was standing on belonged to someone else. Literally. She built her entire maneuver inside a building she didn't own, and she never thought to ask who did. That's what happens when arrogance goes unchecked long enough. You stop checking the things that matter. Petra is home now. Her children are in their own beds. Her husband is doing the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding trust, which is the only kind of rebuilding that actually holds. None of it happened quickly. None of it was clean. But it happened. I drove home from her place that evening, and I sat in my car for a few minutes and drank my coffee, and I thought about my own grandmother, who came to this country with very little and built something careful and quiet over 50 years. She used to say that the point of having something wasn't to show it, the point was to have it when it mattered. I think she was right about that.